Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, your moderator for today, and I welcome you. We have, as always, a great webinar on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you missed any or all of the event, just know that you'll be able to listen to it on demand. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email to everybody who registered, and you'll be able to access the webinar on demand via a link in that email. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for one of our panelists, please don't wait, don't hesitate, just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll take a few minutes near the end of today's presentation and go through the audience questions. And finally, we are doing a drawing for 3 $50 Amazon gift cards. And that drawing will be happening at the end of today's presentation before we close things out. So please stick around and hopefully you'll be one of our lucky winners. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is how to achieve SOC 2 in a containerized environment. Our speakers today are Tim Buntel, who is VP of Application Security Products at ThreatStack, and he's being joined by Chaim Mazel, who is Director of Global Information Security at ActiveCampaign. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Charlene. Really, as always, great to be here. This is a terrific topic today. I'm thrilled to be joined by Chaim. Good morning, Chaim. How are you doing?
Good morning, doing well. Excited to be here, and thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'll give a quick background about me for those who I haven't met yet, and then we'll get off and running.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in the information security industry for about 12 years. A big portion of my career has been involved in AppSec, application security architecture, as well as secure software development lifecycle. I've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to build security programs at several multi-billion-dollar SaaS companies. And I've performed different roles in compliance functionality for ISO 27001, SOC 2, and for PCI as well.
Great. Well, it's a incredible experience that we're looking forward to having you draw on and walk us through your experience there at ActiveCampaign and through your career prior to that. So I've done a couple of these webinars, so hopefully some of the folks in the audience I've met before, but for those of you that I haven't met, I'm Tim Buntel. I look after the application security business here at ThreatStack. My background crosses from security. I've done a couple of companies that are in the security space, but primarily focused on people who build software for a living. So DevOps tools and IDEs and build systems and adding a layer of security onto that. I've also been on both sides of this issue with SOC compliance, SOC 2 Type 2 here at ThreatStack. It's something that we do ourselves. I'm sure when we start to talk about why and what SOC 2, we'll draw on that a little bit as well. So Chaim, I'm fascinated. It's been great working on this content with you to sort of hear your experiences at ActiveCampaign and some of the things that we've gone through at ThreatStack. So for everybody on the phone, again, please do use the questions panel there on the GoToWebinar control panel. We're going to cover lots of really interesting information, and specifically we're going to look at it from the perspective of a containerized environment and deploying in Kubernetes and cloud native environment. So use that question panel. We've left plenty of time at the end to take your thoughts and your questions and drill into that. So I thought maybe, Chaim, you could start us off. Tell us a little bit about ActiveCampaign for folks who aren't familiar with the company.
Yeah, absolutely. So ActiveCampaign is an industry leader in email marketing automation. We have 70,000+ customers worldwide. We have offices in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Sydney, Australia. And our main focus is to enable businesses to optimize their customer experiences. So we have an email marketing platform, a marketing and sales automation platform, as well as a sales CRM. And we've recently introduced, as part of our messaging platform, a new app called Conversations that allows our customers to have meaningful interactions in real time via chat.
Great. So obviously, this is something that's central to that business. And I think we'll come back to that in a second. But let me step back. I know that we have SOC 2 in the title of this webinar, and there's so many different acronyms out there when it comes to government regulations and compliance and auditing. So let's just step back and talk a little bit about the SOC 2, what it is, and why it's important. So for folks who are less familiar with it, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, if I get that right, ACPA, or whatever the acronym would be, came out with this system and organization controls. That's what the SOC is, right? System and organization controls look at these sort of trust principles. SOC 2, though, specifically what we're going to be talking about today, is SOC for service organizations, right? So what it is it's really a report on information security controls, but specifically for companies that work with customer data in the cloud, right? So certainly every SaaS company that's out there is dealing to some extent with customer data in the cloud. We had a great conversation a couple of weeks ago about PCI compliance, right, which was around organizations that use credit card and process credit card data. So SOC 2 has a bit of a more broad take, right? So it's looking at these controls across how you would generally safeguard customer data and whether or not those controls are working. You see here on the screen what those trust principles are for customer data, the security, confidentiality, processing integrity, how you handle that data, and then availability of it, and finally the privacy of the information. So we'll go through in the course of our conversation today a number of the controls that are looked at as part of a SOC 2 certification. Now, I will point out when we say SOC 2, there are these two different types of SOC 2 certification. There's Type 1 and Type 2. The primary difference, to simplify something that is pretty complex because it was invented by certified public accountants, no offense to CPAs out there, but is that Type 1 really presents a view of the organization's controls from a single point in time. So think about coming in, having an audit, looking at the controls that are in place, and assessing those controls, right? So that's very helpful. It gives you an idea of how the company handles customer data. Type 2, however, is a little bit more demanding on the company, but also I think is a little bit more important because what that does is it looks at compliance over a period of time. So the minimum period of time I think is 9 months, and it goes up from there. So it allows you to not only see the controls that are in place, but really are those controls working? And have this sort of analysis of that across time. So we do that here at ThreatStack, where we're looking at not only the controls that are in place, but how are they effective over time, and as we continue to evolve, adding new products, adding new parts to our platform. So that's really the difference between the two. So typically, when you hear SOC 2, you might hear SOC 2 Type 2, or people might just shorthand and call it SOC 2 compliant. So it is important to understand the difference between the two. Ultimately, I think we'll talk about this in a minute in the context of ActiveCampaign, but really what it does is provides an independent assessment of these controls that ultimately are going to benefit the peace of mind of your customers in the end, right? So before we start looking at the specific controls at ActiveCampaign, Chaim, I thought maybe you could walk us through a little bit of your architecture, just a high level, so we can have a picture in our mind of how it's all put together.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are some high-level diagrams of our staging and production environment. For our SOC 2 Type 2, we wanted to make sure that we included everything within the scope. We felt that all of that was applicable, and the way we wrote controls, and we wanted to message those controls out to our customers as a service organization, that made a lot of sense to us. So it's really just high-level basic deployment with data stores, elastic caching, registry, and then to EKS. And we manage that with our Elastic Load Balancer and how it relates to API interactions. I also mapped out the control plane here because I want to speak a little bit about some of the tooling that we use to help fulfill some of those SOC 2 requirements. But more importantly, that gives us continuous insight into our assets at real time. Because SOC 2 is a good indicator that we're taking things into consideration, but we want to make sure that we have full visibility across the org just to be able to have a peace of mind that we have that availability portion there as well.
Great. And I think this is an architecture that probably lots of folks on the call today are familiar with, this basic sort of collection of tooling. But I think the key for me is how quickly these can grow complex, right? You have lots of different systems, each with their own control planes. You have lots of tools that are coming in. So to put these controls in place, it can be complex. And I think we'll hopefully get into talking a little bit about how you deal with auditors too, who may not be familiar with this kind of cloud native architecture. Maybe they've been doing SOC 2 compliance reviews for companies that had on-prem or more traditional monolithic application architectures. I find that we are often in a position of almost advising the auditors, right, to help them understand some of the rapid changes that happen in a full stack kind of cloud environment. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about, so we talked generally about this benefit of making your customers feel a little bit more comfortable if you're in a SaaS business. Maybe talk in the specifics around ActiveCampaign. What are the reasons? SOC 2 is a pretty big investment of time and money. Tell us a little bit about some of the benefits and why it was important for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned before, SOC 2 is specifically designed for service providers storing customer data in the cloud. And at ActiveCampaign, we take our customers' data very serious, and we decided that we were not going to only take every measure possible to secure that data, but we wanted to make sure that we also effectively communicated that out to our customers. And we had an ongoing medium that allowed us to kind of communicate that security posture across all of our current customers and our potential customers. So that was a big deal for us. We also wanted to make sure that we had a standardized framework that was accepted across the industry, right? Because we want to make sure that our customers' requirements aligned with our individual requirements. And after, being part of security questionnaires or sitting on the call and talking about individual things in an ad hoc function, it makes a lot of sense to go ahead and take a standardized framework that everyone can pretty much accept and be happy with, and that we can kind of customize and communicate controls out with and use that for our desired medium. And a big part is also too, it's not just security. A lot of these things, indicate organizational maturity, which is huge for us. There's a lot of process pieces that take place here that just show like, hey, we are a mature SaaS platform and we are following best practices across multiple different business units, not just from a technology perspective, but also it could be from, a people and HR perspective. It could be from a general change management perspective, and just making sure that we're able to communicate, that we might be a company that is extremely agile and moves very quickly and deploys new software and creates all these new features, but we do have certain safeguards in place. This is also a baseline indicator of our organization as a whole, like how much do we value security, and also too, how much do we value doing things the right way across the organization. So it was very clear to us that this was the proper certification, the proper medium to go ahead and invest in communicating those things to our customers. So just to touch a little bit on trust services and common criteria that's set out. As you mentioned, security, availability, privacy, confidentiality, and processing integrity. So they have a set common criteria. So we could go ahead and we could apply these things to our entire organization without reinventing the wheel. So some of those common criteria are organization and management, communications, risk management, design and implementation of controls, monitoring of controls, logical and physical access of controls, system operations, and change management. And we wanted to make sure that we could go ahead and take all of that common criteria and be able to plug that in meaningful controls across our organization, and it will allow us the flexibility to go ahead and make those controls meet our current tech stack. Because some of these things that we encounter can be challenging. So having the flexibility of writing controls with an auditor that help meet our organization's needs and our customers' needs, that was huge for us.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that, generally when we hear about certification or compliance and regulatory compliance, it brings to mind a kind of a wonky thing, right? And you're like, this is kind of a pain in the neck that we have to do. But I like your point that it's really a sign of maturity, right? And if you think about, say you're a software engineer that's looking to change jobs, right? If a company has gone through these kinds of processes and really thought about their controls and put systems in place that allow them to manage these kinds of things, chances are you're going to be walking into an organization that takes, building software seriously, and you're probably going to be happier. I know when we look at the DevOps industry surveys, high-performing DevOps organizations have happier staff, right? And I think SOC 2 is a good way to kind of catalog and inventory and assess all of those processes. So it makes customers happy, it makes investors happy, it can make your employees happy, right? I think those are all benefits that we see ourselves too. Great. So like I said before, SOC 2 exists for all kinds of architectures and different kinds of building businesses and excuse me, and software. We're going to speak specifically, since you showed us your architecture, you're leveraging containers and Kubernetes in your environment. So we're going to go through a few specific examples of that today. We'll talk about some of those criteria and the controls that you were just mentioning, and then some of the ways that you've done it, yourselves. These were ones that I thought were particularly interesting based on conversations that we've had with customers. So certainly the transmission of data, how are you managing data both in transit and at rest? This notion of understanding what's in your environment, right? So being able to detect if there's malicious software or unauthorized software in there, getting into things like approved images and that sort of thing comes up a lot with our customers. There's the ongoing kind of monitoring of system components and things that should be operating a certain way, and you need to have insight into what might be going on if there's anomalous behavior in there. You touched on access control a little bit there. SOC 2 might be looking generally at logical and physical access controls, but when we get into containerized environments in the cloud, there's a lot of different moving pieces to that. Controls at the control plane and other parts of the cloud infrastructure that brings some complexity to how you might have had to do things in the past. And then finally, change management. Again, myself, with having spent a lot of time in the DevOps space and tools and automation and building software here at ThreatStack, we certainly understand how critical it is to have a good understanding of your infrastructure and what the desired system state is, right? And being able to have good insight into that as it comes and goes. So why don't we just jump right in, and Chaim, I'll basically have you walk us through each of these. You can tell us a little bit about the criteria that you set out and what was called for in the SOC 2 assessment itself, and then talk about how ActiveCampaign has built their, how you guys have built your own controls to address them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to start with this first common criteria, and the entity restricts the transmission, movement, and removal of information to authorize internal and external users and processes, and it protects it during transmission, movement, and removal to meet the entity's objectives. So this criteria exists across a lot of different things within SOC 2, but we wanted to figure out how to write a control that was very pertinent to our infrastructure, and decided that for us, that meant that we were going to go ahead and we were going to talk about securing data in transit. And for that, for us at ActiveCampaign, that meant that we wrote a control that says that we are going to go ahead and we are going to transmit all data over TLS 1.2 and all applications. So obviously this is challenging because this doesn't only apply to our data stores and our regular services or any EC2 instances. This is also true for our containerized environments. So as we were going and trying to solve for this particular problem, we decided that we were going to go ahead and use Istio as a service mesh. So for us, that was very beneficial because out of the box, we could go ahead and we could enable TLS between pods and any subsequent interactions thereafter. And we could go ahead and take some additional actions to go ahead and make sure that we were preventing any potential man-in-the-middle attacks, or that it was easily deployed to our ephemeral environments, which was huge.
Yeah, that's we're big fans of Istio ourselves, and certainly seeing a lot of excitement about that in our customers too. Obviously there's lots of benefits beyond just security. When it comes to service discoverability and traffic shaping and that sort of thing. One thing I think that we found was helpful was how Istio can really help us, in addition to the traffic encryption itself, the sort of access control flexibility that we get from it. So mutual TLS, fine-grained access control policies. Is that something that you guys have taken advantage of and are benefiting from some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. So we are using mutual TLS, and we're using that between pods. And so as far as fine-grained access controls go, so we have individual access rules for each of our applications. And so we use these to dictate, what services, via namespace and app combination they can access. And we do that across all of our assets. So it's been really, really helpful because it seems like a simple problem to solve, but, without using, Istio, it was kind of difficult.
Yeah, totally agree in our experience. So great. So let's move on from Istio. Again, folks can feel free to put questions in the go to webinar control panel. We'll have plenty of time to circle back on some of these. I always feel like we could do a whole webinar on just any one of these topics. So, but let's move on to this next one. Walk us through 6803.
Yeah, absolutely. So the common criteria was that we implement controls to prevent and detect any introduction of unauthorized or malicious software to meet the entity's objectives. So that's very broad. So we kind of reined it into our CI process, making sure that we are taking the right things into consideration as we deploy code into production environments. So for us, that control was ActiveCampaign CI process ensures that every change goes through manual and automated approval before it's introduced into production environment. So for us, this is big. Because compliance doesn't necessarily have to be heavy. We're trying to automate as much as we can and make things as lightweight as possible. So our approval process isn't necessarily very manual or very people intensive. We do a lot of green light, red light testing where we deploy a lot of sidecars that perform very specific individual functionality. Some of that functionality is static code analysis. Some other is scanning for using the appropriate licenses, and other could be vulnerability scanning of our actual host OSs or our containers themselves. Like, are we making sure that we're using version golden images? And if these have become out of date, like, is that something that we have to address down the line? So we've also used certain amounts of whitelisting and blacklistings to go ahead and make sure that if something is not using that defined set criteria, that it fails, and we can go ahead and reintroduce that code in a way that meets our standards. So another big thing for this is also that we're making sure that after we go through those approval stages that we do have a manual approval, but a lot of it is just making sure that we go ahead and review audit logs and make sure that everything that was supposed to happen did happen, and that we also have good integrations with some ticketing services and things that are built into our code repo and CI/CD pipeline, which we're using GitLab for that, just making sure that we have like real time feedback, so it doesn't have to be intensive and cumbersome, and it can be lightweight, and we can go ahead and implement all these different controls, and we can really feel good about everything that we're continuously deploying into our production environments. And then we also make sure that we're storing all of our artifacts in ECR, and we make sure that everything has a signature, and we try to validate that nothing has actively been modified and set up alerting in the case that something has bypassed that process.
Yeah, it's such a good point that this tension exists, I think, in a lot of folks' minds between the goals of automation that come with DevOps and kind of CI/CD pipeline processes, and this belief that compliance requires this heavy touch and roadblocks and these kinds of weighty processes. So I'm really excited to hear you describe some of these kind of ways that you've managed to fit it in. We likewise try to do that ourselves at ThreatStack. I know, interesting mentioning the registries there. A lot of customers that we talk to can sometimes find themselves rapidly growing in complexity as they scale their systems and have lots of resources in those registries. Any thoughts on how you guys manage scaling? Do you use tags to manage resources in the registry, or what are some approaches you've managed to put in place to help scale this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely, 100% we do. Things become very unmanageable very quickly without the appropriate tagging. So what we try to do is we try to separate snapshots from production-ready images. And on top of separating the repositories, right, we also use different tagging policies. So let's say, for example, an ActiveCampaign, like snapshots contain a snapshot version plus like a specific commit. But where like full releases, right, they're only effective a release version, right? And so we try to make sure that all tags are mutable, and once that they're written, like that's it. They can't be overwritten. And also for us, that means that the latest tag, right, like it's never it shouldn't be used at all. And that's a way for us to kind of keep things sane from a management perspective.
Gotcha. So I think maybe for folks who have been following along, it'd be helpful for us to kind of, before we move on to the next control, if you could walk us through a little bit about sort of how your system fits together around KUBEs, and then we'll transition to sort of your SDLC and how the phases and the different security realms go here. So do you mind walking us through this?
Yeah, absolutely. So we go ahead and we use GitLab as our main repository tool, and also for our CI/CD pipelining. So it's huge for us. So in order for a developer to go ahead and deploy and to kick off a certain build, so we use authentication with Okta, and Okta also ties into Vault for secret management. So it could be that everyone uses role-based access controls, and they have access to go ahead and kick off exactly what they need to kick off, and only that, and also have very specific permissionings for maybe their particular apps or their particular teams tool sets. So once we do that, we go ahead and we also reintroduce manifests using Helm that are very specific to those individual environments. We also plug in the secret management portion aspect of that with Vault. So we don't have to worry about specific environment variables and all these other things. Vault rotates and handles all of that for us gracefully, which really, really, really makes things much easier. We've kind of automated ourselves out of the problem in relation to that as well, which has been a huge win for us. And then we use ThreatStack for security observability, and we've found that that the ThreatStack agent within our container, it really, really helps from an intrusion detection perspective, and also it helps us kind of identify that nothing jumped our process, and that everyone is following the right things, and we don't have any actions that are taking place that are outside the norm.
Yeah, one thing that, I mentioned at the beginning that sometimes we have to help train the auditors to understand how all these technologies fit together. The flip side of that for me is we're finding that more folks that we work with that are doing these audits are familiar now with some of these technologies as they become more, widely adopted and accepted, and it actually helps speed up the process, right? So they can look at that and say, oh, okay, we understand the benefit that you're going to get from using Vault for your secrets management, and it kind of accelerates the conversation with the auditors, right? Oops, sort of went. Did I go too far? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, getting excited and hit my keyboard there. So, great. All right. So let's move on. We're going to go now to the next requirement. Yeah. So pick us up from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next requirement, the criteria that was given forward in the framework, is the entity monitors system components and operation for those components for anomalies. They're indicative of malicious acts, natural disasters, or errors affecting the entity's ability to meet its objectives. Anomalies are analyzed to determine whether they represent security events. Yeah, so for us, that was like simple, especially when we're talking about Kates and we're talking about our infrastructure as a whole. And we decided that we were going to write a control that was very IDS centric because we wanted to make sure that we had real-time alerting on all our assets, and especially our stateful, our stateless, our ephemeral, and our mutable. Like, it's all the same. Like, we need to have real-time visibility, and we need to figure out a way to do that, and that could present some unique individual challenges. So for us, the control meant intrusion detection software is deployed to all internal ActiveCampaign cloud-based assets, and it's configured for continuous monitoring. So a quick win for us was using the threat stack agent in our containerized environments because we were already using it everywhere else. And we love the feedback that we were getting, and the real-time alerting that was extremely useful for us. So when ThreatStack introduced the idea of being able to have that very specific container, that's something that we jumped at because we felt that was lightweight. It would help us solve this problem, and it would also to provide actionable items that would be valuable for the rest of the organization. So when we were doing this, we also kept automation in mind, that if there is an alert that effectively kicks off a ticket or ticket creation in Jira, and that it goes to multiple different parties, and it also has a severity level. And within that, not only do we have an SLA that we have for the ticketing, but we also have chat notifications in very specific rooms where people can actively start working on something that might have been identified, or triage of something that might have been identified.
Great. And I'll give a kind of a quick explanation of ThreatStack before we wrap up. But really appreciate the way you kind of tied these pieces back in. When we look at our container monitoring, I know we're going to kind of come back to change management and some of the controls there at the end, but I know a lot of teams have been looking at our container monitoring capabilities to look for things like unauthorized changes to Docker config files, for example. Are you also looking for those sorts of things in the monitoring?
Yeah, absolutely. So any unwanted changes are immediately alerted on. This has been like huge for us. So also for Docker config files, and also for lots of other very specific things within our environment. But this not only provides us like with insight if someone's, if there's an actual incident of concern or something like that, but also if someone's bypassed our controls for our deployment process, right? Like, hey, have you actively logged in and edited something that you shouldn't have? And I feel like that's just is equally important. Like, we have to make sure that we're doing the right stuff. Everyone has the ability, to do things, but in a concerted way, right? That's why we try to work automation, into everything with DevOps, because we want everything to be controlled. We want everything to be streamlined, and we want everything, to be repeatable. So it's really worked well for us. And then also, like, in general, on the change management side, like, we treat Docker configuration files like any other build and deploy template or any other infrastructure as code, and we give it the same scrutiny as the rest of our code base. So as code's introduced, it goes through a PR, has a review process, and we go ahead and actively do diffs, and then we raise flags and potentially fail builds if anything seems amiss.
Yeah, it's a great point about this balance between freedom and control, right? That's really what, at the core of a lot of organizations, DevOps transformations too, right, is how do you strike that balance? And as you are more and more successful with DevOps and the velocity increases, finding a way to maintain that balance becomes even more important. And I think a lot of these techniques for full stack monitoring or having visibility across the entire infrastructure become even more important there, right? You got to kind of loosen things up for developers to move quickly, but also have some of that those rules in place that can handle things pretty responsibly in automated fashion as you do get faster, right? So it's a great point. So let's move on here, getting a little bit more into some of the controls at the access level.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that we had to solve across the organization, and it was a big challenge for us up front, but it's something I think that we addressed extremely well. And this is something that we had already done, so we kind of wrote the control around the implementation that took place. So the criteria that we align this to is the entity implements logical access, security software, infrastructure, and architecture over protected information assets to protect them from any security events to meet the entity's objectives. So for us, that meant that our marketing automation platform, that all the system components, all the logical access, that we controlled it through application groups or roles, or when it was possible through native security components. It's something that I also think is really, really important to mention. A lot of this tooling has amazing things already built into it, or as we keep iterating through these open source projects, and it's very important not necessarily to recreate the wheel and to use some very specific things or best practices around some of this tooling that we're using. So for us, how we achieve this is through identity and access management with Okta and Vault. So we wanted to make sure that every single cluster was managed through IAM for Okta. So anytime that there was something that needed to be kicked off or someone needed access or there was a certain functionality that had to take place, we wanted to go ahead and make sure that we either had very specific granular rules around end users, or we wanted to make sure that we had very specific service accounts that performed certain functionality and had limitations regarding exactly what they could do. So another thing that we did is code changes managed through GitLab, which I mentioned. So we make sure that everything is always audited, and that we have a audit log of all access, and then we repeatedly kick off jobs that go ahead and send that to our ticketing system. So periodically, we'll do dumps, and those dumps will get sent into a ticketing queue, and that ticketing queue will be reviewed by someone to make sure that all of the processes that have been kicked off or deployed, or all of the actual engineers who have accessed them have been done so properly. And then we make sure that we go ahead and we manage all of our releases through GitLab. This has been huge for us. We used to use a different repo technology, and we found that GitLab has also really helped us be able to release software, safely and more readily. It gives us additional insight, and it has additional plugins where we can go ahead and we can make this very attractive, especially from an auditor's perspective. We can go to one centralized place, and we can show every single end user who's accessed certain environments or certain clusters or performed certain tasks or certain maintenance. And we can also go ahead and show everyone who's actively pushed or promoted code and what those changes are effectively across organization.
Great. I continue to be sort of surprised when folks are putting together a lot of this, these controls, that they still rely on simple kind of password access to. I know a lot of these, the systems now are making it much easier to do multi-factor authentication, two-factor. That's something you guys do as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So on top of us also doing ephemeral tokens, so we don't actually have passwords or password rotation, but we also require MFA everywhere. So we have MFA set up with Okta, and in order for an engineer to receive like an active token through Vault that allows any type of access to any infrastructure asset, they have to validate that session via MFA with Okta. So that's been extremely helpful, and up front, we thought that might be too heavy, right? We didn't want to impede, developers being or engineers being able to do their work. But it's gone over really well. It's just a simple push notification, and everyone's been really happy with it. And also, little shameless plug, we just built and released MFA, multi-factor authentication, for ActiveCampaign's marketing automation platform. And we are in limited beta release, but we're looking to do general release within the end of this quarter.
That's great. And I love this when, as a product company ourselves, when some of the things that we do internally can make it into the product, right? And we can kind of draw on that experience that we have building safer software ourselves and make that available to customers. So before we move on, I really like this idea that you had to kind of overlay this onto your development lifecycle. Why don't you talk us a little bit about how these realms kind of tie into that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So I threw this in there because I want to talk about also to some of the IAM stuff as well for every portion and piece of this, right? So from the time that local devs actually taking place till the time like we start moving to CI and we do integration testing and we start pulling artifacts and deploying them forward. So every single step of the way has very specific functionality, as everyone knows. But we also too want to make sure that through this process that we're taking the same considerations and same scrutiny into account, and that even though things are delivered, very, very, very fast, and that we have all this automation set up, only the people who actively should be deploying certain projects are, and that we are actively and confidently releasing production code. So we might release, multiple times a day. In some cases, other cases we might release once a day. But every time where we have an active release into production, everyone is confident that nothing has bypassed this product. None of these steps have been skipped, and people are taking all of the data and metrics that we have accumulated via logging and auditing, and that we're dumping them into ticketing that can actively be managed by our auditors.
Great. So good transition there. When you're looking at things that are changing, both bringing software into production, but there's also the change of the environment, right? So tell us a little bit here about some of these controls around the version controlling.
Yeah, that's huge for us. I've been in other organizations where we did not have the best version controlling, and unfortunately, the latest version of something could or artifact potentially be overwritten, and it caused a lot of headaches, and there was a lot of scrambling to identify and verify that all of our production staging and development environments matched one-to-one on active releases. So the criteria set forth is the entity authorizes, designs, develops, or acquires, configures, documents, tests, approves, and implements changes to the infrastructure, data, software, and its procedures to meet its objectives. For us, that was very simple, especially from a DevOps perspective. From a container perspective, ActiveCampaign uses version control libraries to store custom application code for our marketing automation system. We want to make sure that we were very meticulous with versioning everything, and we also made these things immutable for us to be able to keep track of all our deployments and make sure that we were actively having images that match deployment templates. Things can go sideways very quickly and become very confusing, and then you have to kill, deploy, and spin things back up, and we didn't want to go down that path. We decided that for our deployment process, that we should have a very, very environmental specific deployment manifest using Helm, which has been super helpful. And we also make sure that we're using version control, like with our CI/CD pipelines, and make sure one-to-one that everything that gets introduced into a very specific environment, it is exactly what it's supposed to be. And Helm has been great also too for those specific manifests that we deploy to various environments to help us keep track.
Yeah, I was at a KubeCon when it was a couple months ago, I guess now, and you know, with the reliance on Git and building things around that, I was hearing lots about GitOps, right? You know, I'm a big fan of everything as code, of course, but familiar with GitOps? Does that come up for you guys? You know, sort of using Git as a workflow for CD. Is that something you guys looked into or have incorporated?
Yeah, absolutely. So we looked at GitOps and we experimented with it a little bit internally. We tried to use it for monitoring changes and updating deployment files. When we originally looked at it, was kind of hard to integrate, and we're lacking some features that we really wanted to see. But you know, we were moving very fast at the time, and it could be that we didn't give it the proper attention that it deserved. And you know, it could be also too, this was a while ago, that you know, it might meet our current needs today. So.
Well, I think you touch on a lot of the principles that are there, right? Which is really just thinking about, you know, your systems have state, and version controlling that state can be helpful, right? So thinking about everything as code, and thinking about maintaining state through some of the techniques that we use for source code, right, in our application code, makes a lot of sense for folks, especially when they have workflows already built around using these tools for managing, like I said, their application assets. So cool. So you know, that was a great walk through you know, a number of these controls. I'm sure, you know, in our case, and I'm sure in yours, these documents are really long. There's lots of different criteria and lots of different controls, but I think that was a great overview that touched on a number of things that I'm sure other folks have faced. Give us a couple of seconds of sort of, you know, how do you then, once you've built these, how do you deal with the auditors, and maybe a bit about what you've learned through the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So interacting with auditing firms, which is basically CPA firms for SOC 2, I've encountered a couple different problems to solve. So you know, SOC 2 framework does not take a lot of things into consideration because it is very broad, and organizations can help define their own unique controls. But really, this was like a standard IT kind of governance framework that was built out, that now we have to kind of go ahead and evolve and retrofit to modern tech stacks. So the biggest part of that is being able to effectively communicate some of the technology that we're using to auditors, and by doing so, that helps us write more efficient controls for our organization. Because part of the process is you sit down with your auditor, you go over common criteria, and then you map that back to how that fits for your organization when writing controls. And to be able to effectively, you know, write controls at the speed and velocity which most organizations would want, you really have to go ahead and make sure that that auditor is taking the modern architecture into consideration. Because you can sit with an auditor and you can spend 30 minutes writing a specific singular control, or, you know, I've had it happen where, you know, it took closer to 45 minutes just because the auditor didn't really understand the problem we were trying to solve. And within communicating that and explaining it, you know, we had to go ahead and keep refining that idea. So auditors might not fully grasp like modern technologies and implementations, and that is a real world problem. And some auditors and some associations or some groups that do auditing are better than others. But I think, you know, in order to really be able to write the control in an effective way, you have to be able to speak to the spirit of the control, and you have to say like, hey, this is the risk that we're trying to mitigate, because effectively that's what SOC 2 is. It's a risk mitigation framework that helps you communicate that out to your customers. So this is the risk that we're mitigating. This is the technology that we're addressing, and this is the control that is going to address that overall issue. So it's really, really, really important to try to explain things up front.
Yeah, and we find that putting things in these terms help internally as well, right? So we don't want to get as hung up on the tools and the technologies, they're enablers, but really we want to keep people focused on why are we doing this, right? So what's the risk that we're trying to address? And that helps people feel more comfortable with understanding sort of why we're doing things. So a couple of good points here, I think, in terms of what your experience is so far. To share your thoughts here, and then we should have time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing is, operability means auditability. If we're able to go ahead and be able to deploy software the way we want to do it, I have, ephemeral, environments deployed in the way that we think is repeatable, automatable, and auditable, then that is like the core mission statement of pretty much containerization, orchestration, and DevOps as a whole. So I think that really containerized environments are, it's inherently connected to being able to achieve SOC 2. There's a lot of pieces in place that lend themselves very, very well for SOC 2 audits and general compliance overall. So it's huge, right? Because we have to make sure that we have evidence, right? Evidence or it didn't happen, and that's also, I think, a core mission statement of DevOps, that everything's repeatable, everything's auditable. So, which leads into the next portion, automate everything always. If we can templatize logging, alerting, and we can put everything in automated workflows, and we can integrate ticket creation, it's really half the battle. Once a process is created and once we have a template across the infrastructure, it's pretty much set it and forget it. I mean, there still has to be active participation and review, but it's exponentially easier than trying to validate assumptions like on a periodic basis, in one-off ad hoc fashion. Like that's never going to work, especially when we have things, firing continuously. So the next one is treating containers and orchestrators like other assets. Like this is really big. Sometimes we overcomplicate things, and we have to think about this as a whole. Like, Docker and Kubes are built on Linux frameworks, right? So they essentially rely on namespaces, IP tables, control groups, and protocols that already have established and existing best practices. There's NIST standards and frameworks for all of these, and a lot of these security controls can be implemented by built-in functionality, right? So we just want to make sure that we're establishing best practices, we're not recreating the wheel, and we're also looking to implement potential things that help solve these problems, that are built in. So. And the last one is choose a good auditing firm. Right now, we chose an amazing firm. They just get it. They understand our organization and our environment, and they understand the controls, and they understand the problems that a modern SaaS company, faces. So as we're going ahead and writing the controls, like the process has been extremely lightweight. We've had very, very good velocity, and that hasn't always been the experience for me. So I think when an organization is looking to fill SOC 2 Type 2, it's extremely important to interview your auditor to make sure that they're going to be able to help you facilitate your audit and your SOC 2 Type 2 report or Type 1, in an expedited fashion. If you get hung up writing controls for 6 months, it's not going to be a good time.
And this is a relationship we find that is ongoing, right? Especially in Type 2, where you're looking over time. So it's a great point. We want to save time for at least a couple of questions. And folks, remember, there's a Amazon gift card giveaway at the end here, so don't miss out on that. Unfortunately, I can't get it. So, grumble. But obviously, I won't spend too much time on this, but we touched a little bit on threat stack in the conversation and this importance of security observability as part of this process. As I mentioned too, Threat Stack has gone through this, and we'd love to talk to folks who are joining today who might want to learn a bit from our experience and have a conversation with us about ways that we might be able to help you as you're looking at implementing the SOC 2 assessment yourself. So great. I think there was so much good stuff here. We didn't have too much time for questions, but I don't know, Charlene, did we have one or two, maybe one to squeeze in?
Yeah. I think we can get one in, or two if you guys speak really quickly. So let's just go ahead and dive right on in. First question: are you storing the Helm charts with the code or in a different repo of all Helm charts?
Yeah, so we're actually doing separation. We have individual teams essentially have a repo with those individual Helm charts, and we felt that that's been helpful for us and for our organization.
All right, great. Another question for you. Do you have any other compliance framework needs? And if so, do you manage each framework independently or use one framework as a source of truth for other controls?
That's a really good question. So we have some other frameworks that we also adhere to, and SOC 2 and having the actual framework dictate a lot of our controls has been extremely helpful with some of the other ones. So another one is HIPAA, and another one is GDPR. So HIPAA specifically, was accomplished through by default by all the SOC 2 controls that we had written for our entire organization. And since we went ahead and implemented those across the board, when it came down to time for SOC 2 readiness HIPAA readiness and auditing, 95% of all the activities were already done, and it was extremely easy to go ahead and to accomplish. So yeah, it's SOC 2 has been great for that.
Okay. All right.
It's a good
great.
mindset, right? So you just get into that mindset of how do you deal with auditors and how do you build these frameworks. So I think that's nice that it can be repeatable. Yeah,
100%.
Awesome. All right. I think we got time for one more question here. Do you do feature flags, and how do you audit? Excuse me. How do you audit flag transition?
Yeah, so we do feature flags, and we do it across the board, but also too for feature flags, some of the things are very specific to the actual development teams. So not everything is feature flagged, but something that we consider essentially maybe a little bit of a higher risk that touches multiple components across our platform, we feature flag. And we do that so we could also fail forward, right? Like this is a very easy way for us to go ahead and kind of keep track, make quick decisions where we effectively are not acting retroactively and trying to solve outages. And it's been, for big and small releases that are very platform systemic, it's been extremely helpful.
All right, great. Well, we're about 3 minutes to the top of the hour, so unfortunately that is all the time that we have for questions. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize, but please know that the folks at ThreatStack are going to be able to are going to get a copy of all the questions. So hopefully they'll be able to follow up with you offline. And I do want to remind the audience that today's, excuse me, I'm so sorry, my allergies are killing me today. I do want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, you won't be able to access it on demand. We will be sending out an email after the event that will take you to the webinar right on demand. It's also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always find it there. Just go to the webinars section of the website, look on demand, and it should be right there. And while you're there, please feel free to take a look around at all the other webinars that we have, both upcoming and on demand, and hopefully there'll be one or two that pique your interest. Before we close things out, I do want to do the drawing for the 3 Amazon gift cards at $50 each. So without further ado, let's do our first winner, who is Fausto Dedeski. Congratulations, Fausto. Our second winner is Mari Federo. Congratulations, Mari. And our third winner is Uday Ladd. Congratulations, Uday. All right, and thank you everybody for taking part in today's webinar. Tim and Chaim, thank you so much for your time. Great presentation today, lots of good information.
Thank you, Charlene, and thanks, Chaim. Been great fun.
Amazing. Thank you so much. My pleasure.
All right, great. Well, I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.